Hello and welcome to Insurrection with Brenton Lengel, formerly carried on the Starcom radio network, now carried on my YouTube channel. For those of you guys who don't know me, welcome. I am a poet, playwright, former activist with Occupy Wall Street, and author of both the Ringo Award-nominated series Snow White Zombie Apocalypse, the fourth issue of which is currently shipping. A lot of people have gotten it. If a few of you haven't, I'm sorry. I'll get it to you very soon. I'm also the author of Durruti, Shadow of the People, which is a comic about the life and death of anarchist Buenaventura Durruti, which you can still pre-order. Link is in the description. And I am joined by my good friend Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast. Now, Todd, you and I have been talking for quite a while. I think you reached out to me years ago because you were just interested in libertarian socialism, anarcho-communism, and what folks like that thought. And so, we had some pretty good discussions about that. You've got your own podcast channel, which is the Praise of Folly podcast. And I will put out the link for that as well. Actually, I'll grab that while you're introducing yourself.
Yeah, thanks for having me on, Brenton. On my channel, I cover a whole host of different issues, ranging from history to economics to sociology to philosophy to current events. There's really a lot to dig in. Just more or less what I want to do. There's a lot of interviews too, as well. People I just think that are interesting. Mm-hmm. A little bit less now, but you'll see a lot of interesting people that I've interviewed there as well. And of course, Brenton, you've been on quite a few times.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, it's always good to talk to you. You are one of the people on the right I feel like I can have a good faith conversation with, and you've proven that in a number of times over the years. So. I guess my first question, you came to me with the idea here, and you sort of wanted to talk about anti-capitalism on the right, and you'd watch some of my streams, I think, with Ben Burgess, and you kind of came away with the opinion that Ben or a lot of people on the right think that, or a lot of people on the left think that there can't be real, genuine anti-capitalist sentiment on the right. So let's talk about that.
Yeah, well, I actually think a good place to start is actually Karl Marx's The Communist Manifesto, where he actually sort of identifies what I would consider right-wing concerns vis-a-vis the bourgeoisie. So he says, the bourgeoisie historically has played a most revolutionary part. The bourgeoisie, wherever it has gotten the upper hand, has put an end to all feudal, patriarchal, idyllic relations. It has pitilessly torn asunder the motley feudal ties that bound man to his natural superiors, and has left remaining no other nexus between man and man than naked self-interest, than callous cash payment. It has drowned the most heavenly ecstasies of religious fervor, of chivalrous enthusiasm, of Philistine sentimentalism, in the icy waters of egoistical calculation. It has resolved personal worth into exchange value, in a place of the numberless indefensible chartered freedoms, has set up that single unconscionable freedom, free trade. In one word for exploitation, veiled by religious and political illusions, it has substituted naked, shameless, direct, brutal exploitation. The bourgeoisie has stripped of its halo every occupation hitherto honored and looked up to reverence with awe. It has converted the physician, the lawyer, the priest, the poet, the man of science into paid wage laborers. The bourgeoisie has torn away from the family its sentimental veil and has reduced the family relation to a mere money relation. Now, I'll go on and read a little bit more later, but I think it's pretty clear that if you look at these things that Marx is criticizing the bourgeoisie doing, we can see that Europe in the 19th century still has a lot of feudal institutions. And what's important here is if we look at, say, the work of the technologist Jacques Ellul and his On Technique, he points out that modern technical society, now it's a more fundamental critique than just capitalism, but at this time, capitalism is the means by which investment is, accumulated in order to push for further technical development. And what we see, though, is prior to that, we have a lot of intermediate institutions. We have, obviously, fraternities and guilds and, tribal confederations, Catholic Church, not the Catholic Church itself, but schools within it, like, monastic orders and philosophical orders. So you have a lot of these intermediate institutions, and Marx is pointing out that these are all being squeezed out by the process of capitalization. And a lot of people in Europe at the time, of course, resisted that vociferously, just not effectively. And I think that would constitute an in principle objection to this commodification and privatization of things. A good example of this is the German Westphalian thought thinker Justus Muser, who in the late 18th century pointed out that the moral values of Christendom, the virtues of Christendom, are being eroded by the demands of the market. So, given the principle that we only have so much time in the day to do anything, if we spend all that time in the day trying to make profits and get one over our fellow man, that's time we're not spending in religious contemplation or developing good behavior or habits. And so he saw that as a direct threat he saw that as a direct threat to the moral health of Europe. And so while all of these would be considered obviously reactionary from a leftist perspective, I think nonetheless they are at least in principle, anti-capitalist position.
Yeah. Well, and you're not wrong about that. Capitalism, if you are the type of person, and I oftentimes I think of politics and political identification as a product of a couple of things. It's the product of your circumstances, your relationship to the means of production, but it's clearly not just that, because for instance, there's a lot of workers that are heavily reactionary, that they developed what leftists like to call false consciousness. There's a lot of people who you would think would be leftists, but because of other aspects of their environment and their culture and their community, tend to be more interested in right-wing values, even though the actual values that they are interested in oftentimes are assailed and destroyed by capitalism and the profit motive. Now, there's a dumb way of talking about this, I think, and then there's a smart way of talking about it, or an insightful way. Like, I think the dumb way of talking about it is like when you get a lot of right wingers now who have embraced anti-capitalism. You heard a little bit of that talk from Charlie Kirk to a certain extent. You hear a little bit of it from Tucker Carlson, where they're suddenly interested in corporate domination. Oh, gee, I wonder why. Oh, it's because like Twitter banned Donald Trump. So suddenly they're talking about nationalizing Twitter, when before, if you talk to them about nationalizing, like, oil, gas, power, healthcare, they'd freak out. Now these guys are pundits. Their job is to kind of, I guess, rile up the peanut gallery every week or whatever. But also, like, let's take a look at like people who are, for whatever reason, they're interested in more traditional ways of life and more traditional ways of thinking and being, and that absolutely can be valid. And is capitalism their friend? No, it's really not. Like, I can't even, the Bible specifically says, like, you cannot serve God and Mammon, for instance. Now there's, big currents of, American evangelical conservatism that says, no, you serve God and Mammon. And by serving Mammon, you're really serving God, and you'll get rich doing it, kind of like an Amway scam. But, I can't believe that everyone who is interested in their religion, who takes it seriously, for instance, that they aren't able to see the problem there, that essentially because of the pursuit of capital, it's going to override all previous institutions. All culture will be made to serve capital. And so if you're someone that is a conservative, as in you want to conserve existing social institutions, I would think that there is a place, a natural place to push back against, what capitalism does. I think that somebody who tends to look at things a little bit more from a leftist perspective, it's definitely something that I can see. And I honestly wish I saw it more on the right. Now, I will point out, by the way, also, we did get a comment just a second ago, and I wanted to address this before we go too far. This is from Slenderman. By the way, Slender, love you. Love having you on the channel. Your comments tend to be really good. Right-wing anti-capitalism is basically fascists complaining that capitalists are too soft by paying workers wages rather than locking them in a chain and making them essentially slaves. I'm not going to say that there's nothing to that perspective, but I think... and I know what you're getting at there, but I think there's a Steelman version of this as well. So just wanted to address that right there. And when we're talking about this, we're not talking about fascism, just to make that very, very clear. We're talking about a right-wing critique of capitalism. So Todd, do you want to continue here? So I've been talking for a little while.
Oh no, yeah, that's fine. Yeah. Now, as far as the take you brought up on religion, I think is a good one, because if we look at the general history of Christianity, there was the anti-usury position in the Middle Ages, and continued and I mean, really, even with like the Puritans, the idea of accepting usury during the Renaissance, which both the Catholic Church and the Puritans did, took time. It wasn't something that they just jumped to immediately. It was something they had to work themselves up to. And if we also look at it again, I think they would be considered rightists generally. Islamic fundamentalists also take a very dim view of capitalism, whether it's ISIS or the Taliban or anything else.
Friend of the show, ISIS. Yeah. But yeah, no, I know what you mean. Like,
but the point is, though, we'll start with the United States, I think, in particular. They never really had a kind of conservatism like in Europe, and also, when you look at the sort of I guess if you wanted to look at Tucker Carlson and sort of steelman that position, the idea is beginning in the Cold War, there's this idea that capitalism and the religious right are sort of on the same team because we're fighting, team communists, because
fighting the godless communists.
Yeah. The Soviet Union was going to kill both of us. That was the, understanding if they win. Now, that was an alliance of convenience, a lot like the Allies and Stalin in World War II. They had nothing in common other than a common enemy.
Yeah.
And I think what ends up happening is, as the old saying is, old beliefs die hard. I think when you finally see the old enemy go away, and then there's no external pressure for this union, you then begin to see, hey, wait a minute, things aren't turning out the way we thought they were. And without that pressure there, that threat, you can sort of think more clearly, because when you're in survival mode, it's like, we're going to die soon. In that frame of mind, you can't really extrapolate and think clearly. Whereas, because you're getting into an embattled mindset. Like a good example of this might be, for instance, this is sort of the ill-fated alliance between leftists in Iran and the Islamic fundamentalists, to overthrow the United States and the Shah and essentially defeat capitalism. And I think the feeling was in a lot of the sort of Iranian intelligentsia at the time was that after the revolution, they would return to their mosques essentially. And, obviously that's not what happened. And the country became a theocracy to a certain extent. And I don't want to, saber rattle or anything. I mean, but my point in bringing that up is that, war makes for strange bedfellows. And when you're facing a common enemy, as you pointed out, I won't say that the Allies and the USSR had nothing in common. I do think that if you looked at the Enlightenment values of Europe that informed, a lot of liberalism, you could see even, as different as, the Reds were, you still see a lot of those Enlightenment values that have been completely abandoned by the Third Reich. So in a way, even though they hated each other so much and feared, I think the second the Russians won their civil war, they got attacked. But even though they hated each other so much, I think there was a lot less in common between everyone and fascism, even though it might have appeared early on to be a little bit different. Now, But I think the astute point here that Marx has in the manifesto here is that religion was being corrupted already at that time to be essentially wage workers. So priests or ministers are no longer agents of God, but agents of whoever pays them.
Yep.
And
Go
ahead.
I was just going to say, Alan Watts actually talked about that. Because he was clergy for a while, and he knew a lot of the higher ups within clergy. And modern churches tend to depend on donations from wealthy people, and wealthy people oftentimes have a very specific ideology that comes as a result of their wealth, and they don't like hearing some of the more sophisticated theology surrounding specific ideas about Christ. They kind of want the old time religion that makes them feel good for being in the position that they're in. So suddenly ministers who might want to preach something else find themselves under financial strain to preach what their major constituents want to hear and nothing else. So I think that sort of seems to dovetail with what you're talking about, where the priests essentially become employees. Yeah,
exactly. I mean, in a lot of cases, when what would appear to be left-wing groups are acting in non-left-wing ways, again, not to stir up a hornet's nest again, but that's Caleb's claim about BreadTube. The argument is that they've been subrupted. And I think that, a readily charitable view would be that a lot of Christian churches were subrupted, because if you read the Gospels in the New Testament, it's fairly clear that a thoroughgoing Christian ethic isn't going to hoard as much wealth as possible in this life, and then, tell everybody else to eat cake.
Yeah.
If you take it seriously, that's not what's going to happen.
No, certainly not. I mean, you've got Jesus tossing the money changers out. One of my favorite things to bring up in this is in the story of Ananias and Sapphira. Like, God literally kills two people for not being communists. Like, if you go and you read that passage, and modern Christians often, if you confront them with it, will be like, well, it's about the lying. And I'm like, yes, lying about what? Though, because in the story, I don't know if you're familiar with this one, but in the story, there are, the whole Christian community is living with all of their things in common. It literally says that, and it says they had no poor among them, because anytime anybody would sell their property, they would bring all of the money from the sale of the property, put it at the apostles' feet, and then the apostles would distribute it and make sure that everyone was taken care of. And this one guy, Ananias, or Ananias, or however the hell you say his name, he sold a big tract of land and gave 70% of it, gave most of it to the apostles, but kept back a portion of the sale for himself and his wife. And literally, the apostles confront him on that, and they're like, hey, wasn't this land was yours, you owned it, you sold it, the money was completely yours and in your control, and you didn't give it all to the community. You haven't just lied to man, you've lied to God. And in the story, Ananias dies of shame, and then his wife comes and she gets confronted, and she also dies of shame. Now, there's a couple of different ways to read that. There's the reading where God did it. There's the reading where the apostles did it, and just dragged them out, because it did say that the community got gripped in fear. But the point being is that this is very clearly something that the early Christian church took very seriously, which was not basically serving Mammon as opposed to God, and keeping back your own property when people within the church need to be fed and clothed and sheltered.
Yeah, the other thing that I think is interesting is when Marx points out that human relationships, or social bonds being mediated through human relationships, are being now mediated through exchange. And of course, in any sort of traditional or right-wing society throughout history, social bonds, usually bonds of fraternity or marriage or religious duties and obligation, are sort of the glue that holds the community together. And all of those things are, what they are is they are immanent, in the sense that you are eminently related to someone else in the sense of, this direct experience.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas the exchange is anonymous, right?
Yep.
You don't need to know that person. You don't need to trust that person. You don't need really almost anything from that person except this one-time, one-off transaction. And so a lot of, in Europe and the United States, a lot of people thought this is terrible.
Mm-hmm.
They didn't really conceptualize how to fight back necessarily, but they saw the danger of replacing these personal bonds,
Mm-hmm.
these organic personal bonds, with the sort of commodification that exchange produces. And I think that that's also very important, because what I think the right and the left would say against the capitalists is that they would want a restoration of human bonds. I think what the left would say is we want to build institutions that are different than the earlier ones for various sundry reasons. They think they're unjust or they're obsolete or whatever. And the right's like, well, this so far has worked that we don't really see the need to change it, and we haven't yet seen a better alternative. So that's where the disagreement would be, but they would both agree that a more personal relationship between people is necessary rather than an extremely anonymous one.
Yeah, absolutely. And also, I said at the beginning of this, I think a lot of the time with political identification among people, a lot of the way that you kind of form your politics, it comes from, several things. It comes from your given circumstances, your material circumstances. It comes from your experiences within your life. It comes from your family and important relationships, and comes from your personality. And I think the right has been, the far right in particular has been down on the idea, like they've been down on the idea that diversity is strength. For instance, they get especially fascists get really mad about that because, they think of diversity simply in terms of, strange brown people coming and being near me, and they just can't deal with people moving around. But I think also there's something, it's usually a bad faith criticism that I've heard where they're like, well, what about diversity of thought? And like, when someone says that, like what they mean is, can I spew hate speech, please? No, you can't. But I think that it actually is really important within communities, if we're talking about a push-pull between the past, the present, and the future. I think it's important that there be a number of people involved who have different inclinations. And what we can do in the course of society is have each one of these people working together bring their own unique view and ideas. And as long as there are shared values, and as long as the goal proceeds and there is a functional community there, I think you can come up with the best possible way to move forward most of the time. I don't think it's always a good idea for any one ideology or any one group of people to dominate. It's one of the reasons why I'm an anarchist, and kind of one of the reasons why I don't freak out quite as much about purity among the left, both because of that and because I've seen what leftist purity spirals do to people and do to the movement. It's never pretty. It's never good. So I think that I guess, so how do we, this is my question to you, Todd, because, the question then is, let's say we've got people on the right who do genuinely see a problem with capitalism and see it as a threat to their way of life and their values. How do we find a way to work together to where one side doesn't wind up getting screwed? For instance, just to give you a good example, how do you work with somebody who is, invested in, say, patriarchy and the church and hierarchy and all that kind of stuff, while not throwing, for instance, your trans comrades under the bus? How do you get people who have issues maybe with someone else's, I guess, identity, for lack of a better term, but not just identity. I mean, like, how do you get a communist to get along with a theocrat in such a way that they can have a functional society and actually, move towards a post-capitalist world where hopefully, human autonomy is maximized. So, and we can promote human flourishing. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think the first thing I'd like to say is, how do you get a tanky to work with an ANCOM? That's the first thing.
You find a smart one.
But exactly. But the problem here, right, is neither the political right or the political left are homogenous in the sense that they're a unified front. Each side, when they feel embattled, thinks that's the case.
Mm-hmm.
Right. But then you have like all these, left ball comics, and it's like, I think we're a united front. And then like you look at the left ball and they're all fighting each other all the time.
Yeah.
So I think
same thing happens with on the right as well.
Exactly. The same thing happens on the right as well. And it only look monolithic. Usually what happens to lead to the appearance of monolism is when there's like a key event that somebody views as existentially serious. So everybody, goes to arms. And when everybody goes to arms at that event, it looks like there's more solidarity and unity than there is.
Mm-hmm.
I think probably the first thing I'd say is it's the same way you do it even within the left-wing coalition, right? So there's a lot of outstanding differences between those people and how they fight each other and snipe at each other and be like, well, how do we work together? Mm-hmm. Which is a struggle. I mean, that's still something you guys are working on now. So I think you'd start with the same kinds of principles, fair dealing between people, and say, well, look, we don't all agree on everything, but what we can do is at least respect each other's own spaces or borders, right? So it's like, this is your space, this is my space, and as long as we can respect that, and not start invading each other or doing black ops or something, then we can at least get along enough, right, for the purposes of finding some other mode of production. Yeah. And I mean, there's a lot to it, right? There's no easy answer, right? And some people just may be completely incompatible and incorrigible. That's another possibility.
Yeah. I mean, there's a possibility. I think here's the thing. My view of human nature and my view of people is that we are fluid and that we adapt. There's a core in most people, like your personality gets formed at a certain time, and unless you get like severe brain damage, that personality will be more or less continuous. You might change, like, when I was younger, I was a Republican, for instance, and then a right libertarian, and then a Democrat, and then I wised up, and now I'm an ANCOM, essentially. Not as radical as I used to be, like at the height of Occupy. I've somewhat mellowed in my old age, but like the point is that people are not fixed. We more or less, we have a theme, we have a core that maybe we revolve around or return to. Like, you take a spring and you bend it one way, it's going to want to go back, but it still can be bent. So I think that the idea that there are some people that we just can't talk to at certain points in time, maybe, there's people that for whatever reason just aren't going to listen, aren't going to get along, and then the question is, how do you deal with that? And,
well, look, this isn't even just a political thing, right? We all have friends and family members that are doing something self-destructive, and you can try to tell them that, but they're just not going to listen.
Yeah,
they're just not going to listen at that point in time.
Exactly. So then, you've got essentially three choices. You can. What I think that tends to be the thing, unless it's extremely destructive situation, is you continue to love them and, support them as best you can and hope that you'll be there for them when they change their mind. Or, you can break off contact with them, which I don't know if that helps anybody, but it can sometimes if they're particularly, toxic and destructive. I got in my debate with Stefan Molyneux. He's a big fan of defooing, which is very funny now that I think about it, because so this was something that I wanted to bring up, and I think we've even talked about this. But in the Charlie, Stefan Molyneux talked about families, and in the Charlie Kirk interview with debate with Ben Burgess, Charlie kept bringing up the family. And I have a bit of a pet theory that I'm playing with. And this is that right-wingers kind of make allusions to the family in the same way that Democrats make allusions to identity politics. They take it kind of as like a way to, both the Democrats and the Republicans are funded by capitalists. You know, they and the state exist to make sure that, you know, their primary constituents maintain their property, keep getting richer, and you know, continue in a safe, secure, and profitable position. That's really what they're there to do on a sociological level. Like, and when I say sociological, I mean, like, I guess on a civilizational level. That's what that machine does, that is the state. And essentially the Republicans and the Democrats fight over who gets to be the managers of capital right now. So when Democrats want to look like they're doing something and to feed the people that work for them, they will oftentimes make allusions towards identity politics, more trans female drone pilots, you know, more women CEOs of color, because these are situations where it looks like they can make a change, but it doesn't actually fundamentally change the power dynamic. The machine still does what it's supposed to do. You move around, you know, you rearrange deck chairs on the Titanic. I think the right-wing version of this is to make these allusions towards the nuclear family and the family, because that conveniently means that the capitalists and those in power get to keep all of their property and stuff. That's not the problem. The problem is all of these, you know, degenerates, as they like to put it. I also find it incredibly. So, you know, I'm a family man. I'm married. I have a son. I hope to have more children. You know, but I'm also recognizing that, like, the family unit, as conservatives often talk about it, like, the nuclear family is a relic of the nuclear age. That's why it's called the nuclear family. Like the late 1940s, early 1950s, this family dynamic was specifically created to maintain two things: factory labor, to make sure that the guy was able to go to work and to, you know, assemble whatever it was that he needed to in the factory, and to provide a consumer base to sell as much as possible. Prior to this, people tended to live in extended families and clan-based families, which is how human families have been for the vast majority of time that we've been on this planet. So then what you wind up having is that when you break up the family into the nuclear family, suddenly everybody needs two cars, everybody needs a kitchen table, everybody needs an appliance, everybody needs their own house, which means they have to go into debt to, you know, working with a bank to get this taken care of. And suddenly there's all of these consumers to buy this stuff that is being created within the factories. So I think my point being about this is that oftentimes when right-wingers want to divert to family values, even when they're being, sincere. We'll say they're being sincere. They're not. It's not the bullshit smokescreen that you see out of out of some people on the left. Because some people who want to do identity politics and want to make things, you know, better and more equal in our society, you know, they're not just doing it to preserve capital. But I'm wondering, like, are they not putting two and two together here?
Yeah, and let me step in here. So if I understand you correctly, you're saying that in the same way that the Democrats will cynically want to have a woman of color as a powerful person in order to placate their base, the right would cynically use the family as a way to, I think that happens exactly. Now, I mean, obviously the family as it's seen now, right, by a lot of conservatives. I think the first thing we need to say about Americans in general is that, you know, we live in the United States of amnesia. We don't remember what happened even 30 minutes ago.
Yeah.
So
it's only gotten worse since COVID.
I think the first problem is people, when they say family, there's a lot of ideas wrapped up in there, which they sort of don't really know what that fully orbed means. Now, in part, there's a lot of explanations for that. One is they're disconnected from real families because through all sorts of factors, moving around, divorces, people don't really have a real family, but in their mind, family represents stability, right?
Yeah.
And they might have read some books or novels that have a certain idea of a family, but they don't know what the real thing is, and they haven't studied like the sociology of Europe and family formation, like Jack Goody's theory of the rise of the family in the Catholic Middle Ages. But fine, that's what a lot of them are dealing with. But what they want is what that was used to provide, right?
Yeah.
And so they think, well, this is what I know what it is. So what they're doing, to quote Baudrillard, is mistaking the sign for what the sign represents. Okay. And of course, the powers that be can cynically use the sign to say, hey, look at the sign over here. This sign is identical to what it represents rather than something different. Okay.
Yeah.
And I think that does happen a lot. But what's interesting, though, is the family itself used to be the fundamental mode of economic production. And what actually killed the family was the rise of capitalism, which then said, well, it's no longer the fundamental mode of economic production anymore.
Yeah.
And so it became extraneous. It became unnecessary. And when it became unnecessary, it just sort of gradually vanished away.
And interestingly enough, I'll point out that when it does gradually vanish away, you put people into a weaker, more isolated position, and those people are much more willing to, accept lower wages, and they're much more dependent on you. Like the point I came up with when you break up like the extended and clan-based family, and you have people living in nuclear families, those people are more dependent on the overall society, because they are, physically removed from what has traditionally been their support system. I think it makes a good political canard also, because I think a lot of people, we all have, we all live in, to one extent or another, dysfunctional families. I think there's a famous playwright, I forget which one it was, but he essentially said like, all families are like horribly messed up if you just look close enough. That there is no real such thing as the ideal American family. It's the sign that you don't want to mistake for what the sign signifies, like for the thing itself. So yeah, I think like if you were such a person who was interested in manipulating people, when you go for the family, you're touching something that's universal, that is a part of all of our lives, and that we intuitively understand. Prosperity can come as a result of this, or at least safety, or you also are hitting something that's a pain point for a lot of people, because, as you mentioned, we all have relatives that we, are somewhat in conflict with. So yeah, I think definitely with talking about the family in that way, the dissolution of the family capitalism is inherently opposed to it. And I think the more it could dissolute those kinds of social bonds, in just the way that it's opposed to the tribe and community and anything else that happens to get in the way of profit. I ran out there, so you can keep talking.
Yeah.
I was going somewhere, but I lost it. It's late.
In basically a nutshell, if we view the family as in economic terms, and we view capitalism in economic terms, we would say that the family, and in this, using this more holistic sense of extended kinship groups, clans, things like that, which was normal throughout almost all of history until quite recently, we would say that it was local production for local consumption, and most labor was not commodified, but socially necessary. So you would have the older people, the grandparents, the aunts and uncles, take care of the kids so that mom could do her chores. Young unwed women would also help mom with the kids. And then the sons and the uncles and the brothers would all help in the field, do their work. Yeah. And so, but the condition of aid wasn't, well, what are you going to pay me? It's like, no, you have to do this. It's your duty to do this. But of course, it was reciprocal, because the assumption was if you needed help, then some other member of your family would help you out. Whereas with capitalism, it's the difference here is production is for universal consumption everywhere. You don't produce goods to be consumed where they're produced. You produce goods so they can be consumed anywhere. And the means of exchange is by commodification, which is, something is a commodity if it's produced for the sake of being exchanged for something of equal value. So if you produced a commodity or a good in the family system, you didn't produce it to be exchanged for necessarily something of equal value.
You produced it for itself, to take care of the needs of the family.
Exactly.
Or
so if you made
community.
clothes, for your family, you made it for their needs. You didn't make it to be sold in Bangkok. That's not why you made it, right? And so those are the two, I think, differences as modes of production that you see with a family economy and a capitalist economy.
I'm actually being reminded of a conversation that we had when you were first interviewing me about anarchism. And by the way, I want to acknowledge something with you, Todd. And this is one of the reasons why you're one of the right wingers that I like and that I can talk to. Like, you actually read Marx, and you didn't read Marx in the way that like Jordan Peterson read Marx. Like, I watched his debate with Zizek recently, like the beginning and his opening statements. And I know exactly how he went into that too, because like he started to research Zizek and realized like it's next to impossible to understand Zizek. That's part of his allure. And so what he did was he went and he read the Communist Manifesto, which is like the one Marx thing that every right winger reads, and they don't make any real effort to understand it. They just want to read it because this is the demonic text, and the entire time they're sitting there thinking of ways to denounce it rather than to, deal with the manifesto and the rest and the ginormous mountain that is the rest of Marx's work, on its own terms in good faith. So I wanted to acknowledge you for that, but this conversation, what we're kind of moving in on here, because we are talking about, what I think would be a universal good, which is a community that functions economically in a way that, provides for the needs of those within the community and their immediate neighbors, as opposed to for exchange. You asked me early on, you were talking about like anarchists and families and the abolition of the family and all this stuff. And I pointed out that anarchists tend to, and I mean real anarchists, not ANCAPs, but like real anarchists tend to actually argue that our larger societies that should be based essentially on the familial relationship. You're just extending that to people outside of your own immediate family, to other communities, and the sort of ideal of communism, from each according to his ability to each according to his need, is to expand this relationship essentially to the whole of society. So it's really, really interesting to look at it in this way and through, I guess, this relationship.
Yeah. Now, one thing that I would also want to say, sort of around this discussion, is if we look at a lot of the parochialism of a lot of the right, and this discussion, of course, family itself, it's a very parochial institution. I think what the left doesn't understand is that if we look at Dunbar's number, it's very difficult for people to have personal relationships with more than 150 people, 150 to 200. And so what's going to end up happening is, due to opportunity cost, we literally have only so many hours in it. Let's just say 12 hours in a day, and then you sleep the other 12. How much time can you devote to all of these different things? And especially if these are people that you don't know and are never going to meet. I think what you're going to see is that Dunbar's number is going to come into effect, and people are going to say, well, look, these are the people that I see every day. These are the people that I have to deal with to stay alive. And so for whatever, I'm going to have prior commitments to them. Because
to some random person I don't know.
Some random person I don't know. Now, right. So I think that's where a lot of this parochialism comes in. And see, what I think happens is the left will see something that the right does. And they'll be like, well, that's totally irrational. There's no good reason to do that. But what I think is if you look a little deeper, there are good reasons within certain contexts why people might develop that kind of thinking or that kind of habit. And then you can say, well, is there a better way to do it? Is that the right thing to do at that time? That's a totally different set of questions. But what I would say is, though, I think that that's a eminently justifiable parochialism given these sort of pressures you have to deal with, especially when it's, brute survival, like in antiquity or the Middle Ages, where there is no safety net. Maybe you have the Catholic Church, but even they're being sacked by barbarians. So,
I might say the Middle Ages were per capita a more peaceful age than a lot of us have lived in until like very, very recently. We think of it as a very dangerous time because we focus on castles and battles and wars and stuff. But you got to think, like, after the fall of the Roman Empire, once the Roman dinar became worthless, it was very difficult to field large armies. So there was maybe more of a threat of interpersonal violence, but overall, I think fewer people died violent deaths during the Middle Ages than they did in the centuries before and after them.
Well, also you have to remember the Middle Ages is the backdrop is the Pax Romana, which was the Roman peace, which was like the golden age that people remembered, and they thought compared to that, this is terrible.
Yeah,
right.
Fair enough. I don't know though. Also, it's funny because we do tend to forget and romanticize the past, and I often wonder about that because I think part of it probably has to do with the fact that when we were children, we lived in a very different world than we do when we're adults. In many ways, it's better, but in some ways, it's worse because your parents aren't taking care of you anymore. And oftentimes, like, the right will get accused of hearkening back to some golden age that never really existed. Which is funny because the left oftentimes gets accused, especially with accusations of utopian thinking, of trying to build a heaven on earth or to create some, idyllic world that, according to the people on the right, can't exist. So it seems like it's the same impulse. It's just coming from two different directions. There is a golden age and a right place to be, and it is everywhere but where we are now.
Yeah, well, also the left does have their golden age in the past theories. They usually go to hunter-gatherer societies before agriculture.
Yeah.
So that would be their sort of historicist golden age that many, not all, would point to.
I mean, I'll tell you right off the bat, I would have loved that. I'm very happy with like modern technology and everything that I do, but like living in the woods for 6 months when I was hiking the Appalachian Trail, one of the happiest times in my life. And there a lot of the ennui that I think we deal with within modern societies is because humans essentially, I feel like we fit more as hunter-gatherers than as, or herders than as, the modern market man, if that makes sense.
Well, I think any previous historical age is going to be more rooted and integrated than it is today. And this sense of, alienation, people are going to be like, well, I want to be embedded in something again. And so there's so much in history that you could pick from to do that. But I also think too, when people on the left say that there's no principled anti-capitalism on the right, there's one of two ways they can mean it. One is that the people who are making these claims are really being dishonest and would really just become, capitalist toadies as soon as they got the chance. That's one way that you could read that. I think another more subtle way you could read it is they're saying that even if they are in earnest, they are advocating something that will not truly challenge or overthrow the capitalist system. I think that's another way you could read it. And they'll say, well, we have something that could do that. Now, I think what's interesting is on a sort of national level, you could argue, well, that happened in Russia. Well, maybe Russia was feudalist. That is their best example, but I don't know if Russia was truly capitalist yet. In fact, Lenin didn't even think it was truly capitalist yet, which is why he rolled out the NEP. So, but the real question, though, is, I think, one, the jury's out on both answers. Because in England or the United States or Western European nation where there's a real entrenched capitalist presence, neither one has been successful.
Yeah.
And so whether which one is more apt to achieve its goals is, I think, still an open question. Many of the successes of communism were in feudal countries, which don't quite they were successful in their own way, so to speak, but it wasn't successfully overthrowing capitalism.
Yeah. Well, and not only that, it wasn't successfully overthrowing capitalism, but also that wasn't how it was supposed to work. Like within Marxist theory and Marx-Leninist theory, it's the industrial bourgeoisie. It's not the peasants. Like the anarchists were the ones who really rooted their socialism in peasants and peasant traditions, which is why I like it. Because my family were peasants in the freaking Carpathian Mountains. And, you talked about like the families. I found out reading like a history that my grandmother had written that my great-grandmother, my great-grandmother or my great-great, I can't remember which one, about 5 generations ago, she gave birth to her daughter, one of my grandparents, like in a field and like wrapped her in her apron and, brought her into the house, living in this pre-capitalist society. So I suppose, we're kind of coming up on an hour here, and I know you didn't want to go too long with this. So here's the thing. I had said this before, and I think it has resonated with you in the past, because like, I really think it's better to have a true enemy than a false friend, in the sense that I think that what the goal moving forward politically, our goal shouldn't necessarily be to surround ourselves with people on our team. It should be to surround ourselves with people of character who are going to show up and do, they're going to show up and support you and support everyone else, as opposed to the people who say all the right things when it costs them nothing. And then, you get into the street and you never see them. So like, I guess moving forward, in your view, how do we as a society, not simply the right and left or whatever, but just complicated human beings existing here, how do we move towards a saner, more compassionate and more compassionate, more connected world with what we're facing?
Well, I think what we need, there's like 2 opposite tendencies, right? One is the scorched earth tendency, where you have this Manichaean view of right versus left, and we're just going to annihilate the other side in this eschatological battle of good versus evil.
Wow.
And it's all going to be over, right? That's we see a lot of that. And then, we see the idea that, we could maybe convert everybody on the other side so they'll just go away. That's another one. It's a little more sane, a little more humane, but
it's the same idea.
It's the same idea. And I think what really people need to understand first and foremost is that you're very unlikely to just wipe out or convert wholesale the other side. I don't think that's very likely. Yeah. And I think ultimately the real question we need to look at is how do we, because if you look at the history of nations throughout history, there's always going to be competing nations. They're always going to have different interests, and you're just going to have to figure out how to get along with as little violence as possible. And I think we need to just reduce the expectations. There's going to be no, Manichaean battle between right versus left, where one side just takes out the other side. At this point, I don't see that happening. What we need to do is just dial back the assumptions to start with. What can we actually reasonably assume is an achievable goal? Because a lot of these goals that people operate from are too broad, too utopian, too unachievable. And I think modestly, we just need to start with the fact that we're both going to be around for the foreseeable future, and we need to figure out what's the best way that we can coexist without, slitting each other's throats.
Yeah, no, I think you're totally right. I will actually go as far as to say, if there could ever be a, huge Manichaean battle, not only could you not wipe out the one side, could not wipe out the other side, it would actually be bad if they did, no matter which side did it. Simply for the fact that people, the only way that humans understand things and interact with reality is by matter of degrees. You don't really know cold without hot, and you don't know who the good, respectable people are if there aren't evil, gross, unrespectable people somewhere else. You've got to have that other side, that balance. We exist ideologically, personally, in a polar relationship, everything between the self and the external world, and also the, my tribe and that tribe. I think ultimately these are two sides of the same coin, in the same way, as I said, it's polar. It's not like the North is ever going to conquer the South side of a magnet. You break the magnet in half, it's just still the same magnet. It still will have a North and South pole. So yeah, I definitely think that the Ragnarok, the political Ragnarok, is an illusion that's going nowhere. All right, great. So Todd, where can people find you?
Well, you can find me on YouTube. Just type in Praise of Folly podcast. That's probably the best way to see my content. And I'm on Facebook under Todd Lewis, so you can find me there as well.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And guys, you guys can find me here on YouTube. You can also find my comic, Daruti Shadow of the People, is doing really well. People are still pre-ordering it, and you can still pre-order it. Link is in the description. I just had a great meeting today on moving forward on that, and also a Daruti prequel movie that I'm really excited about. So keep an eye on the channel, because really cool stuff is going to continue to happen. There's one other thing that I did want to say, and this is just to everybody. So I have been noticing a tendency and a level of paranoia that has been growing on the left lately. And it's this idea because, you've got sort of the, I guess, Jimmy Dore sort of faction, where there's kind of the anti-woke left that we've seen. Really what this is kind of coming down to is it's coming down to a fight between the liberals and the Marxists, and those that are more influenced by liberalism, kind of the more DSA types, and those who are more influenced by, Marxism, Marx-Leninism. And we oftentimes find that, there seems to be a populist sect of the left that is, I guess, embracing some more right-wing social values. And some people are seeing this as like a major, major threat. Now, I'm not saying that, there aren't such people. But what I am saying is be careful. Be very, very careful. The reason this fissure is happening is because Joe Biden won. That's 100% why it's happening. It would not be happening if Donald Trump had won. Things would be, in my opinion, a lot worse. There is a break that is happening right now because there are people who are ready to throw away and keep different parts of the system that we have around us, and no one knows how to move forward. So they're essentially inventing enemies. So I would say watch out for that media spectacle. Don't get swept up in it. Hang on, wait, we got Swoletarian in the chat. Oh, this is really exciting. Swole was my partner in the debate with Molyneux. Post left, yes. The split happened as soon as Bernie lost. Indeed. Yeah, I'll give you that. I just think that, like, if we'd been felt more with the orange monster in the White House, people felt besieged enough, and this is what Todd and I were talking about at the beginning of this, that they would overlook certain differences. Now they don't feel as besieged, but they also don't feel like they won anything, and we're screwed. So good pointing that out, Swole. Thank you very much. Todd, did you have anything to add?
No, just thanks for having me on, Brenton.
Yeah, absolutely. So from me to all of you, with this has been Insurrection with Brenton Lengel. Please, those of you out there, please do keep thinking, keep fighting for a saner, more compassionate, more connected world. And I'll catch you on the flip side. All right. Wow, I was going to do this, and then I realized like it was making my voice joscillate. So that wasn't as cool as I was hoping it was. Bye. by.